There's a quiet kind of strength that often goes unnoticed, yet it has a powerful effect on how people feel and respond in relationships. It shows up in a certain type of empath whose presence alone can shift emotional dynamics, especially with those who tend to pull away when things get too close. People with avoidant patterns often create distance, not because they don't feel, but because closeness has historically felt overwhelming. So they step back, minimize emotional exposure, and retreat when intensity rises. But this empath doesn't respond with pursuit, panic, or emotional collapse. They don't chase, they don't pressure, they don't unravel in silence. Instead, they bring something unfamiliar into the dynamic: emotional safety without pressure. This doesn't come from control or strategy. It comes from emotional balance, self-awareness, and a steady inner stability that doesn't rely on someone else's response to feel secure. Because of that, their presence naturally draws avoidant individuals closer, not through force, but through calm consistency. They feel deeply, but they are not consumed by what they feel. Their emotions move, but their identity doesn't shake with them. This ability to stay grounded while still being open is what makes their presence feel so different. Avoidant individuals are often shaped by experiences where closeness came with pressure, expectations, emotional responsibility, or the need to constantly reassure someone else. Over time, they learn that distance feels safer, silence becomes protection, independence becomes emotional survival. So when they encounter this empath, the pattern no longer activates in the same way. There is warmth without grasping, care without hidden expectation, attention without emotional leverage, and most importantly, the empath doesn't depend on the other person's reaction to stay emotionally steady. That creates something rare: connection without suffocation. Closeness no longer automatically feels like pressure. Instead, it feels like there is still space within it. No urgency forces emotional exposure. No intensity pushes them to open before they are ready. The empath's calm presence quietly communicates something unspoken. Closeness does not require loss of freedom. What makes this dynamic even more impactful is consistency. This kind of empath doesn't swing emotionally based on attention or distance. They don't become overly excited when someone engages, and they don't fall apart when someone pulls away. Their emotional state remains steady. That steadiness removes unpredictability, which is often what triggers avoidant withdrawal in the first place. Without realizing it, the avoidant person begins to relax. Distance no longer creates chaos. Silence is not met with pressure. Space is not punished with emotional reaction. For someone used to emotional intensity escalating quickly, this calm response feels unfamiliar, but also deeply relieving. The empath's strength lies in being emotionally self-contained. They remain open and compassionate without overextending themselves or losing inner balance. They can care without self-abandonment. They can listen without absorbing responsibility for another person's emotions. Their boundaries are not rigid or defensive. They are natural and self-respecting. They are not protecting themselves from others. They are simply not abandoning themselves for others. Because of this, they are not looking for emotional completion through relationships. They are already anchored within themselves. This removes an invisible weight from the connection. No one is made responsible for the other's emotional stability. The dynamic becomes more equal. Two people choosing connection rather than depending on it to feel whole. Over time, this steady presence begins to challenge the avoidant person's assumptions. Distance stops feeling like the only safe option because closeness no longer feels overwhelming. Emotional connection begins to feel more spacious, more open, and less threatening. The empath never forces change. They don't try to fix or pull anyone out of their patterns. They simply remain present, stable, and authentic. And that consistency slowly creates a space where even someone used to withdrawal can begin to lean in, not because they are pressured, but because they feel safe enough to choose it. For many avoidant individuals, intimacy is linked with expectation, emotional demand, or loss of independence. So they naturally step back when things intensify. But when they encounter someone who offers presence without pressure, that reflex begins to soften. This empath offers closeness without urgency, connection without demand, and emotional availability without forcing it into obligation. Instead of trying to eliminate distance, they allow space to exist without interpreting it as rejection. And in that space, something quietly shifts. Connection stops feeling like something to escape and starts becoming something that can simply exist without taking anything away from who they are. Their energy carries openness, but without urgency, and that subtle difference completely reshapes how someone with avoidant tendencies experiences closeness. Nothing about them feels pushy or fast. There is no pressure to move closer before readiness naturally develops. Conversations are not driven like interviews, and silence is not treated as something that must be fixed or filled. They understand something important that many people miss. Emotional safety doesn't appear instantly. It develops slowly, especially for someone who has learned to protect their inner world through distance. So instead of rushing connection, they allow it to unfold at its own pace. In this kind of presence, the avoidant person no longer feels observed in a way that demands performance. They don't feel analyzed, evaluated, or pushed into responding a certain way. Over time, their nervous system starts to ease because connection is no longer tied to obligation or emotional pressure. There are no demands for constant reassurance, no need for emotional proof, no expectation to explain feelings before they are ready. What replaces that pressure is patience, a quiet, steady confidence that real connection cannot be forced into existence. One of the most defining qualities of this dynamic is emotional permission. The empath doesn't rush intimacy. They allow space for hesitation without turning it into a problem. Distance is not automatically interpreted as rejection, and silence is not seen as something negative that needs correction. Because of this, the avoidant person feels less need to defend their independence. In many relationships, closeness becomes a push and pull cycle. One person reaches forward, the other pulls back to regain space. That tension reinforces avoidance again and again. But this empath doesn't participate in that cycle. They stay warm, present, and engaged, while still respecting boundaries that others might overlook or misread. That balance removes the emotional pressure that usually fuels withdrawal in the first place. Even their way of communicating reflects emotional maturity. Instead of asking questions that feel loaded or demanding, they engage in a way that feels open-ended and safe. Nothing feels like a test or a requirement. Interaction becomes an invitation, not an expectation. The avoidant person begins to sense something unfamiliar. They are free to move closer or step back without emotional consequences hanging over them. There is no punishment in distance and no pressure in closeness. Over time, something subtle happens. Resistance begins to soften. Curiosity slowly replaces defense. When emotional pressure is removed, the usual protective reactions lose their trigger, and without realizing it, the avoidant starts to engage more willingly, not because they are being pulled, but because they no longer feel the need to run. The absence of pursuit itself becomes powerful. When no one is chasing, there is nothing to escape from. And in that space, connection stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like something that can be explored safely. A major part of what makes this work is emotional self-sufficiency. The empath doesn't depend on constant interaction to feel secure. They are comfortable with space, silence, and distance without collapsing into anxiety or insecurity. Because of that, they naturally model a different version of intimacy, one that includes breathing room. That alone reassures the avoidant mind that closeness does not have to mean loss of autonomy or personal freedom. Gradually, trust begins to build in quiet ways. Small moments of openness feel safer. Conversations deepen without force. Emotional expression starts to appear, not because it was demanded, but because it finally feels safe enough to offer. What makes this shift so powerful is its simplicity. There is no attempt to overpower avoidance with intensity or emotional urgency. Instead, the empath simply holds steady, calm, present, and non-demanding. And in that steady space, something changes naturally. Closeness begins to feel less like something that consumes and more like something that coexists with freedom. Emotional connection starts to feel calm rather than overwhelming. For avoidant personalities, emotional reactions from others often shape their behavior more than words ever could. They are highly sensitive to escalation, even when it is subtle. Many have learned that strong emotional reactions lead to pressure, conflict, or expectations they don't feel prepared to meet. So, when emotional intensity rises, stepping back feels like the safest option. In most relationships, distance is usually met with pursuit. Messages increase, questions become heavier, concern grows into anxiety. Even when it comes from care, the reaction often confirms the avoidant person's fear that closeness eventually turns into emotional demand. But this empath responds differently. Not with indifference, not with emotional withdrawal, but with regulation. They notice distance without overreacting to it. They don't immediately assume rejection, and they don't rush to repair something that may not even be broken. Their calm response sends a quiet but powerful message. Emotional shifts are not emergencies. That alone changes everything. When there is no emotional pressure to escape from, avoidance loses its purpose. The cycle of distance followed by pursuit stops activating. Instead of triggering defense, space is simply allowed to exist. Consistency becomes the anchor. The empath remains steady whether connection feels close or distant. Their emotional presence does not swing between excitement when things are good and disappointment when things are not. That stability removes unpredictability, the very thing avoidance often tries to protect itself from. And in that steadiness, something unexpected begins to happen. The avoidant person no longer feels the need to constantly protect their space. Instead of pulling away automatically, they start to stay a little longer. They start to observe, to listen, to engage without pressure. Because nothing about the connection is forcing them, they begin to choose it on their own terms. Because this empath is internally regulated, they don't rely on immediate emotional alignment from others to feel stable. That single trait shifts the entire emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Avoidant individuals often test emotional environments without realizing it. A delayed reply, reduced affection, or a temporary withdrawal can act as an unconscious check for safety. They observe what follows. If they encounter panic, pressure, or emotional escalation, it reinforces their belief that closeness eventually becomes responsibility they cannot carry. But when their distance is met with calm instead of reaction, the pattern begins to break. Silence no longer feels charged. Space no longer feels threatening. Instead of pressure or emotional consequence, they experience relief. What once felt like tension starts to feel neutral, even safe. The absence of reaction creates room to breathe. At the same time, the empath's steadiness communicates quiet confidence. They don't depend on constant contact to feel secure, and they don't become emotionally unstable when connection shifts. Their balance remains intact regardless of the other person's behavior. That kind of emotional independence naturally invites respect. Connection is no longer driven by neediness or urgency. It exists without pressure underneath it. Over time, something subtle changes. Instead of automatically withdrawing, the avoidant person begins to lean in. With no emotional pressure activating defense mechanisms, Curiosity has space to emerge. They may initiate contact, return after distance, or open up in ways that feel self-directed rather than forced. Non-reaction also prevents escalation. Many relational conflicts don't come from distance itself, but from how distance is met. When withdrawal is answered with anxiety, pursuit, or confrontation, tension increases. The empath avoids that cycle by staying grounded and steady. This consistency creates predictability, and predictability creates safety. When emotional responses are not extreme or unpredictable, the nervous system stops preparing for conflict. In that environment, openness becomes easier and resistance slowly fades. The empath never needs to chase explanations or force clarity. Their calm presence quietly communicates that connection does not require emotional volatility to exist. In that realization, vulnerability stops feeling like a threat. Silence stops being a battleground and becomes neutral space, a pause that doesn't break connection. A common misunderstanding in emotionally sensitive people is the belief that love means fixing, guiding, or healing someone. This often leads them to take on the role of advisor or emotional caretaker. Even when well-intended, it can feel overwhelming to someone who fears emotional exposure. Avoidant individuals, in particular, can experience this as pressure. Even gentle advice may feel like intrusion if it implies they need to change or open up before they are ready. This empath operates differently. They listen without trying to repair. They understand without trying to intervene. Their presence is rooted in witnessing, not fixing. That distinction changes everything. When someone feels understood without being evaluated, internal defenses soften. The need to explain, justify, or withdraw weakens because there is no hidden agenda pushing for emotional exposure. The empath doesn't rush to interpret silence or assign meaning to behavior. They allow emotions and experiences to exist without interference, giving the other person space to move at their own pace. For someone who values emotional independence, this feels deeply relieving. There is no pressure to reveal more than they are ready for, and no expectation to perform vulnerability for the sake of connection. Their autonomy remains intact. Their privacy is respected. That respect quietly challenges a core fear that closeness will eventually lead to loss of control over their inner world. Because avoidant individuals often rely on self-sufficiency for protection, being helped too directly can feel intrusive. Even care can trigger resistance if it feels like emotional management. But the empath's refusal to fix removes that threat entirely. Understanding without intervention communicates trust. It signals that the other person is capable of handling their own emotional process. That trust feels empowering rather than overwhelming. They are not being treated as broken. They are being met as whole. From here, emotional depth develops differently. Instead of being pushed, it unfolds naturally. Space, silence, and lightness are allowed to exist without being corrected or forced into something deeper too soon. Because nothing is demanded, openness begins to feel safe. And when something feels safe, it begins to happen on its own. Over time, the avoidant person may start to open up in small, unexpected ways. Not because they were pressured, but because acceptance made honesty feel less risky. And when those moments appear, the empath receives them with the same calm steadiness that made them possible in the first place. This steady sense of safety allows trust to grow slowly and naturally instead of being forced or rushed. A key part of this dynamic is emotional neutrality. When the avoidant person shares pain or inner struggle, the empath doesn't react with urgency or panic. They don't rush to fix, correct, or change the emotional state. They simply stay present and grounded, offering calm attention instead of solutions. This response prevents the avoidant from feeling emotionally exposed in a way that creates pressure or responsibility for someone else's reaction. Vulnerability stops feeling like chaos and instead becomes something that can exist without overwhelm or tension. At the same time, the absence of fixing protects the empath as well. They remain caring without becoming entangled in outcomes they cannot control. Their compassion is steady and genuine, not driven by anxiety or the need to improve someone else. Because of this, their care stays balanced and emotionally clean. In this environment, acceptance itself becomes healing. The avoidant begins to experience connection without performance, explanation, or emotional urgency. Over time, they realize that intimacy does not require being reshaped, corrected, or emotionally managed. Because nothing is forced, growth happens naturally. Emotional closeness develops not through pressure, but through safety and choice. Emotional independence is often misunderstood. It is not emotional distance or coldness. It is a stable inner foundation, the ability to care deeply without depending on another person for identity, validation, or emotional survival. This empath holds openness and wholeness at the same time. They connect fully without becoming emotionally dependent on the outcome. That balance subtly reshapes the entire dynamic, especially for avoidant individuals. Avoidant people often expect relationships to become consuming over time. Past experiences may have taught them that closeness leads to obligation, emotional responsibility, or pressure to constantly reassure someone else. So distance becomes protection. But when they meet someone emotionally self-contained, that expectation begins to fade. The empath values connection, but does not cling to it. Their stability does not depend on attention or proximity. They remain steady whether someone is close or distant. This removes emotional pressure from the interaction. Connection feels optional, not demanded. One of the most disarming traits of this presence is their calm ability to step back without drama when connection is not mutual. They don't use silence as punishment, create ultimatums, or chase out of fear. They simply respect their own needs and adjust their energy with quiet self-respect. For the avoidant mind, this is unfamiliar. They are used to distance being met with pursuit, messages, emotional urgency, or attempts to restore closeness. When none of that happens, something unexpected occurs. There is no emotional chase to react to. Instead of pressure, there is calm continuity. This non-reaction communicates emotional independence. It is not rejection, anger, or manipulation. It is simply stability in action. And that stability creates subtle accountability without confrontation. The avoidant is left to notice their own level of engagement without being pressured. Paradoxically, this often increases willingness to connect. When closeness is not pursued or demanded, it becomes something that can be chosen freely. The dynamic shifts from obligation to choice. The empath's life remains full and self-directed. Their identity is not built around one relationship. They invest in personal growth, interests, and inner stability, which makes their presence feel expansive rather than consuming. For someone who values autonomy, this is reassuring. Connection does not require self-abandonment. Another important factor is how they handle uncertainty. When distance appears, they don't assume abandonment or react emotionally. They trust their own worth without needing constant reassurance. That steadiness reduces tension and allows reconnection to happen naturally. Over time, a different model of intimacy forms. The avoidant begins to experience closeness based on equality rather than dependency. Defensiveness softens, and curiosity replaces resistance. What becomes attractive is not intensity, but balance. Connection without control, care without pressure, presence without emotional demand. The empath never withdraws love, but they also never abandon themselves to keep it. In witnessing this steady self-respect, the avoidant slowly starts to realize something important. Intimacy doesn't have to cost them their freedom. Closeness stops feeling like something that consumes identity and instead becomes a space where two people can remain fully themselves while still choosing each other, without pressure, without fear. What allows this shift is authenticity. Real authenticity doesn't come from performance, effort, or carefully managed behavior. It comes from emotional honesty, no need to impress, no need to manipulate perception, and no need to hide behind emotional defenses. This empath naturally operates from that place. There is no performance in how they show up. Their presence carries emotional truth that doesn't require explanation, and that truth quietly reflects something back to others. Avoidant individuals are especially sensitive to emotional environments. Many have learned to regulate themselves through distance, keeping things light, limiting vulnerability, and stepping back when emotions feel too intense. Over time, they become highly aware of anything that feels forced, artificial, or emotionally demanding. They can quickly sense pressure, hidden expectations, or subtle attempts to pull them closer. And when they do, their instinct is to retreat. Authenticity disrupts that pattern. There are no emotional games, no hidden strategies, no manipulation through attention or silence. What is felt internally is expressed outwardly. Nothing is exaggerated, nothing is concealed. That clarity changes everything. The avoidant no longer has to decode hidden intentions or protect themselves from emotional unpredictability. Interaction becomes simpler, lighter, and easier to stay present in. Authenticity also brings emotional balance. The empath doesn't amplify emotions for reassurance, nor do they suppress them to appear unaffected. They respond in alignment with what is real, warm when warmth is real, calm when space is needed. That consistency creates something rare for someone used to emotional unpredictability: stability. And within that stability, closeness stops feeling like a risk. Because the empath is comfortable with their own vulnerability, they are not afraid of emotional depth, but they never force it. Their openness is an invitation, not an expectation. They may share honestly, but they don't demand equal disclosure. This removes pressure from intimacy. Vulnerability becomes optional, not required. Over time, authenticity begins to act like a mirror. Without confrontation or analysis, the avoidant begins to notice their own patterns simply by being around someone emotionally steady and unguarded. The empath doesn't point out defenses or interpret behavior. They remain consistent. That consistency gently reveals the contrast between emotional performance and emotional truth. Gradually, the avoidant starts to feel how different it is to connect without masking, chasing, or overthinking every response. And often, that simplicity feels surprisingly peaceful. Authenticity also removes fear of judgment. The empath doesn't evaluate emotions as right or wrong. They meet them with understanding. For someone afraid of being misunderstood or emotionally exposed, this lowers resistance. As trust builds, small moments of vulnerability begin to appear naturally, not forced or requested, but offered in their own time. Each one is met with calm acceptance rather than intensity or judgment. That response slowly rewires experience. Openness doesn't lead to loss of control, it leads to connection. The empath never tries to transform the other person. Instead, they model a different way of relating, grounded in truth rather than protection. And over time, emotional armor begins to feel heavier than honesty. Avoidance loses its function not because it is fought, but because it becomes unnecessary. Authenticity quietly shows that closeness does not require pressure, manipulation, or emotional overwhelm. In that steady presence, a different kind of